In this video, we're going to describe overloading methods in the Java programming language. Not overwriting, that's a different discussion, which we'll have later, but overloading. First, let's remember what a method is. We start with the method signature line. And the first thing that we see on the method signature line is the access modifier. That says who can invoke this method. Next, we have the return type. Void means we're not returning anything. And finally, we have the method name. Now, when we're overloading a method, it means we have two methods that share these first three things in common. The access modifier, the return type, and the method name. That's a given. What differs when we're overloading methods is this next part, which is the parameter type and parameter variable. So think of this like an extension on a phone. You might call a 1-800 number and then be directed to extension 200, something like that. The 1-800 number that you're calling is the access modifier, return type, and method name. The extension is the parameter and the variable, and that tells you who's actually going to pick up a phone. In a more technical example, you can think of a port number. So if you access port 80, that's the default HTTP port for most websites. But then port 22 and port 21, I forget which is which, but those are used for FTP frequently. Port 25 is used for mail. So you see, the first thing that we have here is kind of like an IP address, and then we finish it off with a port which says what behavior are we going to take when we reach this IP address. So how do we change the parameter type and variable, the parameter types and the variable names? Well, let's take a look. In the class vehicle, we currently have a method called go, and the method called go accepts an int distance. So we know those first three words have to be the same. So public, void, go, but the parameter list has to be different. It can't be int distance. Maybe we say string distance. Okay. Now let's go back to driver class and remember something from driver. In class driver, I mentioned that we have this integer.parseInt. This is a class called integer, which is a wrapper class around the primitive type int. In other words, the class called integer has a lot of methods, many of them static methods, which simply offer some convenience when dealing with an int. Okay, so I go back to vehicle, and one of the convenience methods of integer parses a string to an int. So what I could do here is I could say integer.parseInt, and then pass in distance. Now we know that that's going to return an int data type, and we know I can put my cursor on the method name, hold Alt, press Enter, and say assign to new variable, and we'll just call this int distance. And then what we can do is we can take int distance and we can pass it to the existing go method, go int distance. Just like so. And we'll save. I'll snap a breakpoint there, and I'll snap a breakpoint here, and I'll save as well. Now let's go back to our driver class and let's take a look at something. For my vehicle, we are passing in, and let's see, we are, actually it's the go method, we're going a specific distance. I'll tell you what we'll do is I'm going to say, I'm going to add one more line, my vehicle.go, and we'll just say we're going to move it maybe 1 mile, but I'm going to pass in 1 mile as a string. The reason being, I want to debug through this, and I want to see what method calls when we pass in an int data type, and what method gets called when we pass in a string data type. So I'll snap my breakpoint right here, I'll save, and then we'll debug one more time. Okay, so prompt user, we F7, and now we're in our vehicle, some examples that we did earlier, and now we're creating a my vehicle and a your vehicle. Now we get our first prompt for gallons of gas. I'll say 10 gallons of gas, and we'll work through a little bit of math here. Nothing I want to show just yet. I'm just getting us up to the point where we can debug this. Okay, so parse our double. We keep walking through how many miles per gallon. We'll say 10, F8, F8, F8. What's the odometer? 10,000, F8, 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 F8. Enter distance to travel, 100, F8. And now let's take a look. MyVehicle.go int distance. So I'm calling the same method name two different times. Once on line 75, once on line 76. On line 75, I'm passing in an int. When I mouse over, you can see the int in parentheses up above and the little kind of pop-up there. which shows that I'm passing in an int data type. Down below, we see the number is contained in quotes, which means it has to be a string, not a number type. So I'm in class driver. Let's watch what happens when I press F7 and step into this method call for go. I reach the original go method, the one that we put in place originally, because that accepts an int. Now I choose F8, F8, and guess what? We're back to driver now. Now we're on the second call to go, and this time we're passing in the string 1. Watch what happens when I press F7 here. When I press F7 here, we're now in the overloaded method called go. It's overloaded because it shares the same access modifier, return type, and method name. However, the parameter is different. Instead of accepting an int, it accepts a string, and that's what was called. So I choose F8, I convert the string to an int, and now I choose F7, and I walk into the go method, and there we are, and we finish up. So method overloading can take this form. It can take another form as well. We could have int distance, comma, string label, something like that. In this case, it's a different kind of method overloading where we do have the initial parameter that the method has, but we have a second parameter as well. Now, this logic no longer makes sense, so I'm going to go ahead and clean that up. As a matter of fact, I'll probably remove this whole method in just a moment. But nonetheless, for this to work, we have to pass in both an int distance as a number and then a string that maybe says get groceries. And I totally misspelled that, but nonetheless, you get the idea. So the parameters that we invoke, or the parameters that we pass when we call a method, has to be the same type that the method signature is expecting. So in other words, if a method signature expects one int, we have to pass in one int. If a method signature expects an int and a string, then we have to pass in that int and string. We can't pass in just a string because right now there is no method that accepts just a string, so that's going to redline. So very important when you're calling methods, make sure the types that you're passing in match the types that the method is expecting. And the order of types will determine, the order of types and the types themselves rather, will determine which method gets called. Just one int calls the signature with one int, an int and a string calls the signature with an int and a string. So that's a quick look at overloading methods in Java. Hope this has been helpful. Thank you.